The year was 1787, and the air in London was thick with smoke, ambition, and silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind built on secrets. Ships came and went from the docks of Liverpool and Bristol, carrying goods that fueled an empire. Sugar, cotton, tobacco. Wealth poured into Britain like a rising tide. But hidden beneath that wealth was something far darker. Human lives. Men, women, and children were packed into ships like cargo, taken from West Africa, and transported across the brutal waters of the Atlantic Ocean. This horrifying system was known as the transatlantic slave trade, and for decades it had been legal, protected, profitable, and widely ignored. But something was beginning to change. In a quiet room lit by candlelight, a small group of people gathered. Among them was Thomas Clarkson, a man whose life would soon become devoted to exposing the truth. He had once been just a student, but everything changed when he asked a simple question. Is it right for humans to enslave others? The answers he found would haunt him forever. Clarkson began collecting evidence: chains, shackles, branding irons. He spoke to sailors who had witnessed the horrors firsthand. Many were terrified to talk, but the stories they shared were impossible to ignore. Bodies thrown into the sea, families torn apart, people treated as property. This wasn't just trade. This was a crime. Meanwhile, another man was preparing for a different kind of battle, one inside the walls of Parliament. His name was Wilberforce. Unlike Clarkson, Wilberforce had power. He was a politician, respected and well-connected. But even he knew that what he was about to challenge was bigger than any one man. The British economy depended on slavery. Ending it would mean confronting merchants, ship owners, and even members of Parliament who were growing rich from the suffering of others. Still, Wilberforce made a decision. He would fight to make the slave trade illegal. But the truth had a problem. People didn't want to see it. In the streets of London, life went on as usual. Shops were busy, markets were loud, and tea was poured into delicate cups, often sweetened with sugar harvested by enslaved hands. Most people didn't ask where it came from, and those who knew often chose silence. One night, Clarkson stood near the docks watching a ship prepare to leave. The crew moved quickly, avoiding eye contact. Crates were loaded, but not all of them were goods. Some made sounds. Faint, human. Clarkson clenched his fists. He realized something in that moment. If the truth remained hidden, nothing would ever change. Back in Parliament, Wilberforce prepared his first speech. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Many would laugh at him. Others would try to silence him. But he also knew something else. This legal trade was not just immoral. It was a crime waiting to be exposed. And once the truth reached the people, there would be no going back. The fight had begun, but Britain wasn't ready to listen. Inside the grand halls of Parliament in London, Wilberforce stood to deliver his speech. His voice was steady, but the room was not. Some men listened. Many did not. Laughter echoed from the benches. Papers shuffled, a few openly mocked him. To them, the slave trade was not a crime. It was business. But outside Parliament, a different kind of movement was growing. Thomas Clarkson had taken the fight to the streets. He traveled across towns and cities, gathering more than just evidence. He was gathering voices. Sailors, once part of slave ships, began to speak. One of them described the suffocating conditions below deck. Hundreds of people chained together, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Another spoke of the screams that filled the night, and the silence that followed when those screams suddenly stopped. These weren't rumors anymore. They were testimonies. Then came something that would change everything. A diagram. It was called the Brooks slave ship diagram. A detailed drawing of how enslaved Africans were packed inside a ship. Every inch of space was used. Bodies were laid side by side, stacked with no room to sit, no room to turn. When people in Britain saw it, they couldn't look away. For the first time, the horror was visible. Pamphlets began to spread. Posters appeared in public places, and a powerful new symbol emerged, the image of a kneeling enslaved man with the words, "Am I not a man and a brother?" This message reached homes, shops, and even tea tables. People who had once ignored the issue were now forced to confront it. Women especially became a powerful force in the movement. They organized boycotts of sugar produced by enslaved labor. Families began refusing to buy it. even though it was a part of their daily lives. The silence was breaking. But not everyone welcomed this change. Merchants in Liverpool and Bristol grew angry. Their wealth and power were under threat. They fought back. They argued that ending the slave trade would destroy the economy, that Britain would fall behind other nations, that jobs would be lost. And in Parliament, their voices were loud, louder than Wilberforce's. Year after year, Wilberforce brought the issue forward, and year after year, he lost. Votes were cast against him, bills were rejected, progress felt impossible. At times, even his allies began to lose hope. But Wilberforce refused to stop, because outside Parliament something undeniable was happening. The people were changing. One evening, Clarkson received a letter. It was from a young boy who had seen the Brooks diagram. The boy wrote that he couldn't sleep after seeing it, that he kept imagining what it must feel like to be trapped like that. He ended the letter with a simple line, "If this is legal, and shouldn't it be illegal?" Clarkson read it again and again, because that question, so simple, so honest, was exactly what Britain needed to answer. The truth was no longer, by the 1790s, everything was changing in London and across Britain. People were no longer silent. The slave trade had become a public issue. William Wilberforce kept raising his voice in Parliament, but he continued to lose. Meanwhile, ships from Liverpool and Bristol still carried enslaved people across the ocean. Then the French Revolution changed everything. Britain became fearful of big changes, and support for ending slavery slowed down. At the same time, Thomas Clarkson fell ill and had to step away, making the movement weaker. But the people didn't stop. Petitions grew. Boycotts continued. Pressure increased. Wilberforce didn't give up. He knew one thing. The law hadn't changed yet, but the minds of the people already had. The early 1800s brought a different kind of tension to Britain. War was raging across Europe as Britain faced Napoleon Bonaparte and his expanding empire. Fear, uncertainty, and survival dominated political discussions in London. For many, this was not the time to talk about ending the slave trade. But for William Wilberforce, it was the only time. Years had passed. Defeats had piled up. Many of his allies had grown tired, some had even given up. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The British public was no longer divided in the same way. They had seen the evidence. They had heard the stories. They had felt the truth. Now even some powerful figures in Parliament began to reconsider their stance, not because it was easy, but because it was right. Behind the scenes, support quietly grew. New politicians entered Parliament, men who had grown up hearing about the horrors of the slave trade. They weren't as connected to the merchants of Liverpool and Bristol. They were more willing to listen, more willing to change. Then came 1807. Wilberforce stood once again before Parliament. But this time something felt different. The room was quieter, the resistance weaker. When the vote was finally called, the result was overwhelming. The Slave Trade Act of 1807 was passed. For the first time in British history, the slave trade was declared illegal. Celebrations erupted across the country. Church bells rang. Crowds gathered. Tears were shed. After decades of struggle, the law had finally caught up with the truth. What was once accepted was now recognized as a crime. But even in victory, there was a shadow, because the law ended the trade of enslaved people, not slavery itself. Thousands of men, women, and children were still living in bondage across the British Empire. The chains had not been fully broken. Not yet. Wilberforce knew this. As others celebrated, he remained thoughtful, almost quiet, because he understood something many did not. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. Far away across the Atlantic, enslaved people continued to suffer. The ships might stop coming, but their freedom was still out of reach. And the next fight would be even harder. The year was 1807. Across Britain, people celebrated a historic victory. The Slave Trade Act had been passed. Ships could no longer legally carry enslaved people across the Atlantic. For many, it felt like the end of a long struggle, but for others, nothing had changed. In distant colonies across the Caribbean and beyond, slavery still existed. Men, women, and children remained in chains, forced to work under brutal conditions. The trade was illegal, but slavery itself was still legal, and that truth could not be ignored. William Wilberforce knew this better than anyone. Years of fighting had taken their toll. His health was weakening, his voice softer than before, but his determination had not faded. He refused to stop. Not now. The movement began again, stronger, louder, and more urgent. New leaders stepped forward, including Thomas Fowell Buxton, who carried the mission into Parliament. Outside, activists continued spreading awareness, organizing campaigns, and demanding one final goal. Not just the end of the trade, but the end of slavery itself. Public pressure returned, even more powerful than before. Petitions flooded London once again. Thousands of voices demanded justice, not partial change, but complete freedom. The message was clear. If slavery is wrong, it must be ended everywhere. Years passed. Debates continued. Resistance remained. But just like before, the truth could not be buried again. Finally, in 1833, Parliament made its decision. The Slavery Abolition Act of 1833 was passed. Slavery was officially abolished across most of the British Empire. It was a moment that changed history. Just 3 days after hearing the news, William Wilberforce passed away. He had spent his life fighting for something many once believed impossible. And in the end, he lived just long enough to see it become reality. But even this victory came with complications. Freedom was not immediate for everyone. Many formerly enslaved people were forced into apprenticeships, continuing to work under harsh conditions before gaining full independence. Still, the system that had once been accepted, protected, and profitable was finally broken. The crime that had once been legal was now recognized by the world for what it truly was, a crime against humanity.